Picture this. You're one of the most powerful men in medieval England. You own thousands of acres, command hundreds of knights, and your word is literally law over tens of thousands of souls. Kings seek your counsel, your enemies flee at the mention of your name. And yet, on a bitter February morning in 1187 after Christ, you're sitting in your own great hall, wrapped in 6 fur cloaks, and you still can't feel your fingers. This was Lord William de Montfort's reality at Northwind Keep. Here's a man who could afford to feed an army for a year, who possessed armour worth more than most villages, who slept on silk sheets imported from Constantinople, Meassur, and he couldn't sign his own documents because his hands were too numb to hold a quill. His breath formed clouds in the air of his own throne room. The irony would be almost funny if it weren't so deadly serious. Just 6 months earlier, in that very same hall, during the height of summer's blazing heat, his pregnant wife Eleanor had collapsed during the feast of St. John. The stone walls that trapped winter's killing cold also trapped summer's suffocating heat. She nearly lost their unborn child, one Bees, the heir to one of England's greatest fortunes, because a castle designed to withstand siege engines couldn't handle the simple changing of seasons. Now, you might think this was just bad luck, just one particularly uncomfortable castle. But here's what will blow your mind. This was completely normal. This was how the most powerful people in medieval Europe lived. These weren't exceptions. These were the rule. Let me put this in perspective for you. We're talking about an era when more knights died from lung rot in damp towers than from enemy swords. More noble bloodlines ended from winter fever than from battlefield wounds. The very fortresses built to protect the ruling class were slowly, methodically killing them. And the cruel irony? The peasants, the people these lords ruled over, often stayed, warmer in their humble cottages than the earls in their stone monuments. Those despised wattle and daub huts, built with ancient knowledge passed down through generations, used earth berms and strategic hearth placement that actually worked. The common people understood something that the greatest architects of the age had forgotten. Buildings should serve the people inside them, not just intimidate the people outside them. Young Robert witnessed this suffering firsthand. Picture a teenage apprentice mason from Coventry. Nobody special, just another craftsman's son learning the trade. He's working at Warwick Castle, one of the finest fortresses in all of England, and what does he see? Baron Hugh's 3-year-old daughter Margaret, growing sicker every winter in her tower chamber. This tiny girl, born to incredible privilege, her little body racked with coughs that echo through stone corridors like the wails of ghosts. Robert watched proud knights, aka men who had faced down charging cavalry without flinching, reduced to sleeping in the stables with their horses. Think about that for a moment. Warriors who would rather die than show cowardice, choosing animal warmth over noble dignity because the alternative was freezing to death in their own beds. The castle physician, Master Benedict, became Robert's unlikely mentor in understanding this crisis. This learned man, trained in the medical arts at the great schools of Salerno, confided something that should have shocked the medieval world. Half his winter patients suffered from ailments caused purely by cold and damp, swollen joints that never healed, rotting lungs that claimed the young and old alike, the mysterious wasting sickness that swept through castle corridors every winter like clockwork, claiming 2 lords for every season that passed. Master Benedict had studied the old Roman texts, the forgotten knowledge of physicians who understood that environment affected health. He knew what Robert was, only beginning to suspect that the very walls meant to protect were becoming prisons of stone and ice. But here's where our story takes its most fascinating turn. Because this young apprentice mason, ATMB, this nobody from nowhere, was about to discover something that would change not just how castles were built, but how power itself was distributed across medieval Europe. Robert's revelation began with a simple question that nobody else was asking. What if the problem wasn't the weather? What if the problem was the buildings themselves? You see, medieval architects had become obsessed with one thing above all else, making walls thicker, towers taller, defenses more impregnable. They built for war, always for war. But they forgot something fundamental, something that would seem obvious to us but was revolutionary in the 12th century. People had to actually live inside these fortresses. The technology existed. The Romans had solved this problem 800 years earlier with their hypercaust systems, tenuous networks of heated air that flowed through hollow spaces in walls and floors. But that knowledge had died with the empire, lost in the chaos of the Dark Ages. Medieval builders knew how to stack stone on stone, how to engineer a wall that could stop a catapult boulder, but they had no idea how to make a room comfortable. Robert began to understand that he wasn't just looking at an architectural problem. He was looking at a revolution waiting to happen. Because the lord who could keep his family healthy through winter, who could attract scholars and craftsmen year-round, who could turn his fortress into a true center of power and culture, that lord would have advantages that gold alone couldn't buy. But revolutions come with a price, and Robert was about to discover that challenging 8 centuries of building tradition would make him more enemies than the deadliest siege. Robert's journey from apprentice mason to revolutionary began with what most people would call a pilgrimage. But this wasn't your typical medieval quest for spiritual enlightenment. In 1189 after Christ, 2 years after witnessing little Margaret's suffering at Warwick, Robert made his way to the abandoned Roman fort at Chester. While other pilgrims sought miracles at holy shrines, Robert was hunting for ghosts, the technological ghosts of a lost civilization. Picture him crawling through these ruins on his hands and knees, covered in centuries of dirt and debris, ignoring the warnings of locals who insisted the place was cursed. What he discovered would have seemed like magic to his contemporaries. Hollow spaces beneath the floors, channels carved within the walls themselves, the skeletal remains of an ancient hypercaust system that had once carried warm air throughout the entire structure. Now, here's where Robert proved he wasn't just a dreamer, but a true innovator. The Romans had built their heating systems for villas and bathhouses, places of comfort and leisure in times of peace. Robert faced a completely different challenge. How do you incorporate such delicate systems into castles designed for war? How do you hide heating channels in walls that need to stop siege engines? How do you make stone breathe without making it weak? His first experiments nearly killed him. Picture this scene. Robert working in his makeshift workshop behind his father's house in Coventry, testing channel designs on small stone sections. He's trying to understand how air moves, how heat travels, how to control the flow without creating dangerous pressure. Then, disaster strikes. Superheated air, trapped in a poorly sealed channel, builds pressure until it explodes outward like a stone catapult shot. The blast sends chunks of masonry flying across the workshop. His assistant, young Thomas of York, ISA, barely 16 years old, pulls Robert from the flames that engulf half the workshop. Both men suffer burns that will scar them for life. Thomas loses 2 fingers on his left hand. Robert bears the mark of that explosion across his right shoulder and neck, scars he'll carry until the day he vanishes from history. But here's what's remarkable. Instead of abandoning his quest, this near-death experience teaches him exactly what he needs to know about controlling air pressure in stone channels. The breakthrough comes when Robert stops thinking like a mason and starts thinking like a physician. Master Benedict had taught him that the human body worked through the movement of air and vital spirits. What if a castle could work the same way? What if massive stone walls could function like the lungs of some great beast? Robert develops a system that's absolutely ingenious. Warm air from specially designed heating chambers, fed by charcoal fires tended by servants, rises naturally through channels carved within the walls themselves. These aren't simple hollow spaces that would weaken the structure. These are precisely calculated airways that follow the natural lines of stress in the stonework, actually reinforcing the walls while allowing air to flow. The heated air emerges through decorative vents, disguised as carved roses, heraldic shields, even religious symbols. Nobody looking at these chambers would suspect they're anything more than ornamental stonework. Meanwhile, cool air enters through lower passages, creating a constant circulation that banishes both winter's killing chill and summer's suffocating heat. But here's the real genius of Robert's system. He turns the castle's greatest weakness into its greatest strength. Those massive stone walls that had been thermal prisons, soaking up cold and holding it like ice, become thermal batteries. They absorb heat during the day and release it slowly through the night. They store coolness in summer and distribute warmth in winter. The very mass that made castles miserable becomes the key to making them comfortable. Master Benedict becomes Robert's greatest ally in this work, explaining how moving air prevents the evil vapors that cause disease. The physician understands something that won't be proven scientifically for centuries, that stagnant air breeds sickness, while flowing air promotes health. Together, they develop not just a heating system, but a complete environmental control that could save lives. Word of these experiments reaches the highest levels of power when King Richard the Lionheart himself hears rumors of a mason who claims he can make stone breathe. Think about the context here. Richard is preparing for his great crusade to the Holy Land. He knows that more crusaders die from fortress fevers than from Saracen swords. If this mad claim has even a grain of truth, it could change the fate of kingdoms. On Christmas Eve of 1190, Robert receives a royal summons to Westminster. Picture this scene: a common mason standing before the most powerful court in Europe, claiming he can solve a problem that has plagued castle builders for centuries. The reaction is exactly what you'd expect. Earl William of Gloucester openly laughs, declaring that next this fool would claim to make water flow uphill. Courtiers whisper behind jeweled hands. Even the king's architects sneer at this presumptuous peasant. But Richard the Lionheart didn't become legend by ignoring potential advantages. He grants Robert one chance, ASF, a midnight demonstration at Windsor's Tower Keep. The stakes couldn't be higher. Success means royal patronage and the power to transform England's defences. Failure means disgrace, exile, or worse. Picture that winter midnight in the Tower Chamber. Frost covers every surface. The assembled nobles shiver in their finest furs. Then Robert activates his hidden system. Suddenly, impossibly, warm air begins flowing from stone roses carved into the walls. The temperature rises. The frost melts from windows that haven't been clear in living memory. The court falls silent as they witness what seems like sorcery, but is actually superior engineering. That night changes everything. But as Robert is about to discover, solving the technical problem was the easy part. Now comes the real challenge: surviving the political revolution he's about to unleash. Within 5 years of that midnight demonstration at Windsor, Robert's breathing castles had fundamentally transformed the map of power across England. But revolutions, even technological ones, never happen without casualties. And Robert was about to learn that changing how the powerful live makes you very powerful enemies indeed. The Earl of Warwick became Robert's first great patron, and for deeply personal reasons. Remember little Margaret, the 3-year-old girl whose winter coughs had echoed through those stone corridors? She was now 8 years old, and every winter still brought the family to the edge of despair. The Earl had lost 2 brothers to winter fever, and watched his own father waste away in the cold dampness of his inheritance. When word reached Warwick of Robert's success at Windsor, the Earl didn't hesitate. He would be the first great lord to fully embrace this revolutionary system. The transformation of Warwick Castle took 2 years and cost 800 marks, UTLI. Think about that sum for a moment. That's the equivalent of equipping 40 knights for war, complete with destroyers, armour, and weapons. It's enough money to feed 1,000 peasants for an entire year, but the Earl considered it the best investment he ever made, because within 1 winter, the savings began. Picture the change. For the first time in living memory, half the garrison didn't fall sick each December. Noble families stayed year-round instead of fleeing to warmer manors, abandoning their seats of power for months at a time. Merchants established permanent shops within the castle walls, knowing their goods wouldn't freeze solid or rot from dampness. Scribes could work through winter, producing the documents that made medieval government function. The castle became a true centre of power, not just a seasonal fortress, but success bred dangerous enemies faster than Robert could have imagined. The Guild of Master Masons, the ancient brotherhood that controlled all major construction in England, saw Robert's innovations as nothing less than heresy. Led by Walter of London, a master builder whose family had erected cathedrals for 4 generations, they declared these breathing walls an affront to traditional building wisdom passed down since the time of the Normans. Walter's arguments weren't entirely wrong, and that made them far more dangerous than simple jealousy. Channels in walls did create new structural considerations. Moving air systems required maintenance that traditional castles didn't need. The very complexity that made Robert's system work also made it vulnerable to sabotage or simple incompetence. Walter whispered in the ears of conservative lords that these innovations would weaken fortifications, that moving air would actually carry plague faster through a castle, that the very idea violated God's intention for stone to be solid, permanent, and still. The conflict exploded into the open when Robert's trusted apprentice, Peter of Burgundy, committed an act of betrayal that nearly destroyed everything. In 1195, with England and France locked in their endless struggles over Norman territories, Peter sold corrupted plans to French spies. Whether he acted from greed, coercion, or simple stupidity, we'll never know. But the result was catastrophe. The disaster at Mountford Castle killed 18 people when improperly placed channels caused the Great Hall's eastern wall to collapse during a winter feast. Picture that horrific scene. Lords and ladies gathered for the celebration of St. Nicholas, warm for the first time in a December that anyone could remember, when suddenly the wall simply gives way. Tons of stone crash down onto the high table. Among the dead was Lord Mountford's eldest son and heir, crushed while raising a toast to the warmth that had finally come to his family's ancient seat. Walter of London seized on this tragedy with ruthless efficiency. Here was proof that these innovations were not just dangerous but deadly. The traditional masons launched a campaign of whispers and warnings that reached every castle and court in England. They claimed Robert's system was fundamentally flawed, that pursuing comfort would inevitably compromise safety, that this tragedy was divine judgment on those who sought to improve on God's natural order. Robert faced his darkest hour. Several lords cancelled planned installations. New apprentices stopped seeking him out. Even some of his successful installations were abandoned as families chose familiar misery over uncertain innovation. The breathing castle revolution seemed poised to die in its infancy, killed by one catastrophic failure and the conservative forces that had always resisted change. But then came the Great Freeze of 1199. This wasn't just bad weather. This was a winter that entered legend. Chronicles describe ice so thick on the Thames that entire markets operated on the frozen river. Forests of ancient oaks split down the middle from the cold. Livestock froze solid in their pens. In traditional castles across England, the death toll was staggering. Rochester lost 23 members of its household. At Kenilworth, Lord Geoffrey buried 4 of his children in one terrible week. Yet every single breathing castle reported 0 deaths from cold-related illness. 0. While traditional fortresses became charnel houses, Robert's innovations saved hundreds of lives. The contrast was so stark, so undeniable, that even Walter of London's supporters began to waver. The ultimate vindication came when Prince Arthur himself, Tome, the king's nephew, and heir apparent, survived pneumonia in the Tower of London's newly converted royal apartments. The prince had fallen desperately ill during a Christmas visit to the capital. The royal physicians had given up hope when his fever broke and his breathing became laboured, but the steady warmth and constantly moving air in his chamber aided his recovery in ways that surprised even Master Benedict. Within a month, Arthur was not just recovered but healthier than he'd been in years. The royal charter that followed gave Robert the title Master of the Living Stone and established the Brotherhood of the Breathing Wall. This wasn't just recognition, it was protection. The Brotherhood became a secretive guild that guarded construction secrets more carefully than any military strategy. Members swore oaths of loyalty not just to their craft but to Robert personally. They developed coded symbols and hidden signs that allowed them to identify each other and verify authentic installations. But even as Robert reached the pinnacle of success, even as his name was spoken with reverence in the greatest halls of England, the man himself was changing. Those who worked closest with him noticed a restlessness, a sense that he had accomplished something momentous but not yet complete. He spoke often of the broader implications of his work, of how making buildings livable could transform not just comfort but civilization itself. The revolution was no longer just about heating castles. Robert had proven something far more profound, that human ingenuity could overcome the limitations that people had accepted for centuries. If stone could be made to breathe, what else might be possible? What other impossible problems were simply waiting for someone brave enough to challenge conventional wisdom? But revolutions, once started, have a way of consuming their creators, and Robert was about to discover that changing the world comes with a price that gold cannot measure. Robert vanished on the feast of St. Thomas in 1201 after Christ. Not died, vanished. There's a crucial difference, and the mystery of his disappearance tells us everything about how completely he had transformed the medieval world. Some said French agents murdered him for refusing to build breathing castles for King Philip Augustus, who desperately wanted to counter England's new advantages. Others claimed he sailed east to construct a breathing palace for the Byzantine emperor, who had heard tales of the English wizard who made stone live. But Thomas of York, his scarred assistant who had pulled him from those workshop flames years earlier, insisted on a different story. Thomas said his master simply walked into the morning mist on that December day, saying his work was complete and the world no longer needed Robert the man, only Robert the idea. What remained behind was a revolution that would reshape civilization itself in ways that Robert probably never imagined. By 1220, after Christ less than 20 years after his disappearance, no noble family could attract advantageous marriages without a breathing castle. Think about what that means. Comfort had become currency. Warmth had become a weapon in the politics of power. The marriage negotiations between Earl William's daughter and the Duke of Normandy's son collapsed specifically because the Duke's castle at Caen still relied on traditional heating, which is to say, no heating at all. The Earl's daughter, raised in the steady warmth of a breathing castle, simply refused to spend her life shivering in stone corridors. Her father backed her decision because he understood the deeper truth. A woman who married into comfort would bear healthier children, maintain stronger alliances, and extend the family's influence far more effectively than one who married into misery. The technology spread along the crusade routes like wildfire, carried by knights and nobles who had experienced breathing castles firsthand. But here's where Robert's genius truly showed. The system adapted to every climate it encountered. In the Holy Land, the Templars reversed the airflow to create cool refuges from the desert's killing heat. Instead of drawing warm air up from heating chambers, they pulled cooler air from deep underground chambers, creating artificial oases of comfort in the blazing Middle Eastern sun. The fortress of Crac des Chevaliers, which still stands today in Syria, incorporated breathing wall technology that made it not just impregnable but livable year-round. Crusader chronicles describe knights who could remove their armor indoors even in August, something that would have been impossible in traditional stone fortresses. The psychological advantage was enormous. While Saracen forces wilted in the heat, Christian defenders remained fresh and alert. But the economic transformation proved even more profound than the military advantages. Comfortable castles became year-round centers of governance and commerce in ways their predecessors never could. The legendary Breathing Keep of Dover, completed in 1210 under the direction of Thomas of York himself, housed 300 permanent residents engaged in everything from illuminated manuscripts to goldsmithing, i.e., crafts that were impossible in the damp, freezing castles of old. Tax records from this period, IDDO, and yes, medieval bureaucrats kept detailed records even then, show that castle-centered towns grew 3 times faster than traditional settlements. Why? Because comfortable buildings attracted the kinds of people who drove medieval economic growth: skilled craftsmen, scholarly monks, merchant families, and minor nobles seeking advantageous positions. A scribe who could work through winter produced more documents. A goldsmith whose workshop stayed warm could work with greater precision. A scholar whose library remained dry could preserve and copy more manuscripts. The very concept of home versus fortress began to shift in fundamental ways. Earlier castle builders had thought in terms of pure defense. How thick should walls be? How high should towers reach? How narrow should windows remain to prevent arrow fire? Robert's revolution forced them to consider human needs. Where should chambers be placed for maximum comfort? How could natural light be increased without compromising security? What arrangement of spaces would best serve both daily life and military necessity? This wasn't just about luxury, it was about power itself. A lord who could keep his family healthy through winter could focus on politics and expansion rather than simple survival. A castle that attracted and retained talented people became a center of innovation that multiplied its owner's influence. A fortress that remained fully functional year-round could respond to threats and opportunities that would paralyze traditional strongholds. Modern excavations have revealed just how sophisticated Robert's original systems really were. When archaeologists opened the walls of Warwick Castle in 1987, they discovered engineering that defied everything scholars thought they knew about medieval capabilities. Channels calculated with mathematical precision that wouldn't be formally understood until Newton developed his laws of thermodynamics. Thermal mass equations carved directly into hidden chamber walls, airspeed measurements marked in the stones themselves, showing that Robert understood principles of fluid dynamics that wouldn't be rediscovered for centuries. Dame Margaret Whitfield, the archaeologist who led the Warwick excavation, made a statement that should send shivers down the spine of anyone who thinks ancient people were somehow less intelligent than we are. She declared Robert's work medieval engineering that surpassed Roman techniques and prefigured modern passive climate control by 8 centuries. 8 centuries. Think about that timeline. Robert was solving problems in 1200, after Christ, that we're only now beginning to appreciate in our modern Oman, struggle with energy efficiency and climate change. Today, as architects rediscover passive heating and cooling to combat our environmental crisis, they study Robert's breathing castles with newfound respect and astonishment. His principles of thermal mass, natural convection, and strategic air movement are being incorporated into modern green buildings. The man who vanished into morning mist 800 years ago is helping us build a more sustainable future. But Robert's true legacy isn't written in stone alone. It's carved into the very idea of what human beings deserve from their built environment. Before Robert, people accepted that buildings would be uncomfortable, that winter meant suffering, that comfort was a luxury only the gods could enjoy. After Robert, comfort became an expectation, a right, a goal worth pursuing with the same intensity that medieval people pursued military victory. He proved that human ingenuity could transform even the coldest fortress into a place where children could play in winter, where scholars could work year-round, where life could flourish within walls built for war. That revolutionary idea, too, that buildings should serve the people inside them, spread far beyond castle walls to transform how we think about homes, churches, workshops, and every space where human beings gather. The mystery of Robert's disappearance may never be solved, but his revolution lives on every time we expect our buildings to keep us comfortable, every time we refuse to accept that shelter means merely surviving the elements. In a world where we're rediscovering the wisdom of passive climate control and sustainable design, Robert's legacy reminds us that the most profound innovations often come from the most unexpected sources. A humble apprentice mason who dared to imagine that stone could breathe, and in breathing, could give life to the civilization sheltered within its walls. Some revolutions are written in blood. Robert's revolution was written in living stone, and it changed the world forever.